Any manual of usul al-fiqh from any era describes Allah as al-hakim. And so to make a masdar from this is necessarily to say that there is something that we can call hakimiyya. The only difference, I suppose, is that the tendency to create those sorts of masdars, a masdar, I don't know how to translate masdar in Bangla, but an abstract noun drawn from a noun like hakim is in the modern period very commonly done with a ya ta ending, ya and ta marbuta ending. So in Arabic, for democracy, ganatantra, we now say dimokratiyya. For various concepts, we add the ya and the ta, and it becomes the concept behind it. But the concept is implied in the word hakim itself. And the hakim is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The shari' is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the expression that our dear brother and scholar Toha Tariq just mentioned, that the notion of the scholars also being hakim, this is actually recognized in a limited sense. There's a qualified sense in which a scholar can also be hakim, because the Prophet ﷺ in these books is also sometimes described as hakim, but he's a subordinate hakim. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ, that the Prophet ﷺ, when he speaks as Prophet, he is also speaking, conveying Allah's message. So he's not an independent shari', and the ulama are not independent shari' either. But they do have a role of a certain kind, and I think this is nicely articulated by Ibn al-Qayyim when he describes them as al-muwaqqi'ina al-rabbil alameen. They are signing on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you go to any classical manual of Islamic law, and you will recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is hakim, universally acknowledged in our tradition. Okay, so let me begin with a date. Not 2024, not 1971, not even 1952. The date is the 27th of November 1948. On that day, on this campus, at the gymnasium ground, the General Secretary of the University Student Union handed a memorandum to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaqat Ali Khan, demanding that Bangla be made a language of the state then being Pakistan. That young man, I'm very honored to say, was my grandfather, Professor Ghulam Azam. Not yet a professor, of course, but at the time, the General Secretary of the Student Union. I mention this not to claim anything. This is qadr that I am his grandson, but to point out that from the very beginning, this university has understood the deepest political questions are not questions of budgets or ministries. They are questions of language, of loyalty, of who we are, and above all, of authority. So the question I want to place before you tonight is the oldest and simplest political question there is. Who commands? Banglaয় বললে, কার হুকুম চলে? Whose command shall we operate according to? Everything that Maulana Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi ever wrote is arguably an answer to this question. To understand him, we have to set aside the widespread caricatures that we've been exposed to for decades. But let's just briefly introduce him. Apnara bhalo kore janen already. Maulana Maududi was born in 1903 in South Asia, in a South Asia that was colonized entirely by the British at the time, and hence he was born into the British Raj. Think of what it meant for a Muslim in Bengal or Delhi in those years. You could pray in the masjid, but because the colonizer generously permitted it. But the law that governed your property, your contracts, your marriage, your life, and your death came from somewhere else. Colonialism, Maulana Maududi saw, was never merely the theft of wealth. It was the transfer of hukum, of the ability to rule from one throne to another, and its deepest consequence was of the imagination. The colonized person is the one who can no longer imagine being governed by anything else aside from what the colonizer has left. Maulana Maududi's genius, and I use this word advisedly, was to see that independence would be hollow if it changed only the personnel of that command structure and not the source of the underlying structure. Brown Shahibs replacing white Shahibs was not liberation. That in essence, he was warning to the independence movement. That was in essence his warning to the independence movement. The question is not who sits in the seat. The question is what the seat answers to. And so Hakimiyya is a word which comes from a 3-letter root. Ha, kaf, mim, hakama. The root of hukum, to command or judgment. The root of hakim, the one who commands, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Islamic tradition. Of mahkama, the court. Of hikmah, wisdom. In Bangla, you say it every day without noticing, hukum. The Quran states, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the principle in a handful of words in Surah Yusuf, Inil hukmu illa lillah. Hukum belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Inil hukmu illa lillah, amara alla ta'budu illa iyyah. He commanded that you do not obey anyone but Him. Notice what this verse does. In the same sentence, it is saying hukum as command, authority and sovereignty, and he aligns this with ibadah, worship and service. These two things are aligned. To recognize Allah's command is an act of worship in and of itself. To serve another master is thus ultimately, in the Qur'an's own grammar, a corruption of both politics but also of faith. Your iman is affected if you do not recognize that hukum belongs to Allah alone. And when Western political theory speaks of sovereignty, sovereignty Bangla apne bolchilen sharvmukto. When Western political theory speaks of sovereignty, it precisely means this, that the highest authority that will answer to nothing but itself. There is no commander above it. There's no authority above this person. And Maududi simply asked the question that no one in colonized society was supposed to ask. Who actually holds that seat? And he answered with the kalima, La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah was never a private sentiment in the way in which religion has been shaped in Western society since the Enlightenment. It was a public statement of who my allegiance is in every area of my life, not just in my private life. Where did Maududi work all of this out most in the most explicit form? It wasn't, not in fact in a political pamphlet, but in a work of Quranic semantics. In the early 1940s, he published a small and somewhat controversial book, the controversy I deal with in one of my published articles, whose Urdu title translates into English as 4 basic Quranic terms: Ilah, Rabb, Ibadah, and Deen. And it's a study of those 4 terms. His argument was that over the centuries, these 4 words quietly shrank. Ilah had come to merely mean the object of one's salah, one's prayer. Rabb merely meant the creator of the universe, but not more than that. Ibadah had become ritual, in the same sense that Western religions think about rituals. And Deen merely became religion in the modern European sense, a private compartment of life. Sunday for the Christians, Friday for the Muslims. Now we can have debates about the historical accuracy of these claims, and I argue that to a certain extent there is a rhetorical force to framing it in the way that he did, but I don't think it's historically accurate of the Islamic tradition. But this is a separate discussion and debate. But Maududi went back to Arabic revelation and showed that each word was vastly larger than this narrow scope. Rabb in the Quran was not just the object, the creator, but he was actually the master, the provider, and crucially the lawgiver, the hakim. That is to say, Rabb indicated that sovereignty belonged to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exclusively. Ibadah similarly includes obedience and service, but also it implies service in the public sphere. It implies the political meaning. And deen is not religion as understood after the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Religion was not something which is a private affair that people believe inwardly as a belief system, but does not have a role in the shaping of society and public affairs. Instead, it is a complete, comprehensive order under which a person lives. It is their law, their ultimate loyalty, their way of life. আমরা বলি বাংলায় সম্পূর্ণ জীবন বিধান. When those four words are understood, as Maududi would argue, in the Quran's demand, then it becomes clear that he is basically saying that the Quran demands of us to give our entire lives to the deen, not just a belief that there is a God. That belief translates into real life transformation of how we think of our role in society and how we should shape our society. Now, the standard scholarly objection that we hear in the seminar rooms from Princeton to Dhaka is that all of this understanding is a modern invention. Maududi brought something which is unprecedented. Muslims never talked about government in this way. They never talked about Allah as being hakim in the way that he does. In fact, the word hakimiyya doesn't even exist before the 19th century. And this is actually true in the sense of the way in which these scholars, the last part is true, that hakimiyya as a word is an invention of Muslims debating with the British colonists in the 19th century. But the notion that this is an exclusively modern reading is something that I have spent some time exploring and published in a short article. And the reality is, this objection doesn't really survive scrutiny. Any manual of usul al-fiqh from any era describes Allah as al-hakim. And so to make a masdar from this is necessarily to say that there is something that we can call hakimiyya. The only difference, I suppose, is that the tendency to create those sorts of masdars, a masdar, I don't know how to translate masdar in Bangla, but an abstract noun drawn from a noun like hakim is in the modern period very commonly done with a ya-ta ending, ya and ta marbuta ending. So in Arabic, for democracy, ganatantra, we now say demokratiya. For various concepts, we add the ya and the ta, and it becomes the concept behind it. But the concept is implied in the word hakim itself. And the hakim is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The shari' is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the expression that our dear brother and scholar Toha Tariq just mentioned, that the notion of the scholars also being hakim, this is actually recognized in a limited sense. There's a qualified sense in which a scholar can also be hakim, because the Prophet ﷺ in these books is also sometimes described as hakim, but he's a subordinate hakim. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ, that the Prophet ﷺ, when he speaks as Prophet, he is also speaking, conveying Allah's message. So he's not an independent shari', and the ulama are not independent shari' either. But they do have a role of a certain kind, and I think this is nicely articulated by Ibn al-Qayyim when he describes them as al-muwaqqi'ina al-rabbil alameen. They are signing on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you go to any classical manual of Islamic law, and you will recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is hakim, universally acknowledged in our tradition. In any school, I suppose any Sunni school of any century, this will be true. Among the first questions it settles is, who is the hakim? And the answer is unanimously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The scholars do not make the law. The labor is to discover it, to uncover it. This is, of course, an area of debate when it comes to that which the Sharia is silent upon. I will not go into that here, but the scholars, as Ibn Taymiyyah points out, in the 7th century, they built, Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Kathir also, both students of Ibn Taymiyyah, carry forward this argument. And it's perhaps the first point at which there's a serious competitor to the Sharia in terms of thinking about authority, sovereign authority. And this comes in the form of the Mongols. The Mongol invasion and their overthrow of Baghdad and their instituting of the Sharia, but parallel alongside it, they instituted something called the Yasa, which was Genghis Khan's code, because he was their Sharia before they converted to Islam. And alhamdulillah, they converted to Islam subsequently. But Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of Mongol rule was grounded precisely in this principle. And go further back still, and the very first century of Islam, when we have the Khawarij claiming La hukma illa lillah. And this is now, unfortunately, the ulama as-sultan, unfortunately some corrupt ulama utilize this to attack Islamists, as has been happening in places like Al-Azhar, unfortunately. And this is not universally true of all Azhar scholars, but some scholars who are supported by the state have done this sort of advocacy to say that Islamists in our own time are basically the Khawarij. But notice how the authoritative Sahaba, the Khalifa at the time, how does he respond to the statement from the Khawarij, in al-hukmu illa lillah? Does anyone remember what Ali radiallahu anhu said in response to that? Kalimatu haqq. It's actually true. In al-hukmu illa lillah. No one can deny it because it's in the Quran. Urida biha batil. But it's being misused and abused for batil ends. And so, even in a context where there's a misunderstanding of how we translate kalimatu haqq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words. In another famous interaction that the Khawarij had with the Sahaba, because they debated the Sahaba, and in particular Ibn Abbas, and reportedly a third, maybe half of them came back to Islam, a proper understanding of Islam. Reportedly, I think this is narrated of Ibn Abbas or Ali radiallahu anhu, they brought a copy of a written Quran and they said to the Quran, speak, tell us what to do. Here we're taking hukm from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. And the Khawarij acknowledged immediately, it can't speak. And then he said, well, that means that you have to mediate that process. You are speaking. So when you say, inil hukmu illa lillah, then it's not that it's transparently obvious. We actually do have to have a certain degree of interpretation. But I want to emphasize mainly that 14 centuries ago, before any modern critic could say, this is all modern ideas, before modern ideas were even dreamt up by the Europeans, the tradition already held both things at once. The principle that Allah's command is true and unimpeachable, and that the weaponization of that principle against Muslim society is a corruption and is unacceptable. Whoever tells you Hakimiyya is foreign to the Islamic tradition has not read the Islamic tradition. But intellectual honesty also is necessary and requires the second half of this sentence, that something in Mawdudi rahmatullahi alayhi was indeed a new invention of the sort. In fact, a number of things. Firstly, he addressed the modern state, an institution with powers no sultan had ever even dreamed of. The census, the school, the railway, the broadcast apparatus, the media institutions, the court system that displaces the Sharia as a mechanism of implementing the new sovereign's commands. Pre-modern rulers would tax you, but the modern state proposes to form you from birth, to shape you through your life, and to even register how you die. the modern state is a leviathan. It's an absolutist entity from the beginning. And this is why, actually, as my colleague Humaira Ikhtidar at King's College argues, Maududi actually realized that the comparator for Islam as a whole way of life wasn't Christianity, it was the modern state itself, as they conceived of it. This is why, alhamdulillah, there's a coming acknowledgement among scholars. It's been articulated already that Maududi was quite an original thinker and a groundbreaking, you could say, a post-colonial theorist of a sort. Second, the form. Maududi presented Islam as a nizam, a complete system able to stand on the same field as capitalism, communism, nationalism, and to contest them. That gave Muslims the confidence to think politically again, but it also carried a risk, which I'll come to. And third, the vocabulary of sovereignty itself was taken from the Western political sciences and turned back against it. Some call that contamination. And I think there's always a risk. But this is how human thought develops over time. And I call it the way in which scholars have always engaged other civilizations. Ghazali did this with Greek logic. Various scholars interacted with other civilizations and incorporated elements that they found acceptable, but also created limitations or boundaries which they considered other. One thing which is worth noting, which I haven't written down, is that it is important to note that Muslims, like great scholars like Maududi, when they make these interventions in these moments in our history, are doing something unprecedented because they are trying to articulate Islamic thought in a moment of Muslim weakness. When Ghazali is writing, the Muslims dominate in their region of the globe. When great scholars are writing in our history, when Abu Hanifa is writing, when Imam Bukhari is writing, Muslims are in power. But Maududi is writing in a moment of weakness. So the susceptibility to alien influence in a problematic way arguably is greater. And the risk of not being able to control our own narrative is also greater. Here is the part that Maududi, part of Maududi his critics rarely quote because it ruins the caricature. If Allah alone is sovereign, who rules on earth? A priesthood? A clergy? Holding the keys to heaven? Maududi's answer is an emphatic no. Islam does not have a church. It doesn't have a clergy. His answer comes from Surah Al-Baqarah, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I am placing upon earth a khalifa or vice-regent or a delegate. And Maududi reads this as addressed not only to kings, not only to scholars, but also to the average believer. All of us are khalifa, khalifatullah fil ard. This is a bit of an innovation as well. And it's, again, an adoption of a value of popular sovereignty that Andrew March has so elegantly and I think persuasively written about, with my reservations that I've articulated in a review of his book. The whole community are trustees authorized to exercise this khilafah. Even the khalifa is just one of these khulafa. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses khalifa in the Quran, He's not using it in that political sense. He's one of the khulafa, and if he does something wrong, then we have the obligation as the rest of the community to do amr bil ma'ruf and nahi anil munkar. And this can happen against a shoirachar, as it happened in July 2024. But if the Khalifa is behaving that way, we have to also express that this is unacceptable. Follow or think about what this does to power. Power becomes first delegated, never owned. No one who is in power is ever the ultimate authority. Above them, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. There is always Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that Noah Feldman, I think, articulates very nicely in his book, The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State. He says, this is something that the West never knew at the time. Islamic constitutionalism establishes the principle that, and this is with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who says, I've been appointed upon you, but I'm not the best of you. I'm just one of you. It establishes the principle that no one is above the law, no one is above Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The West at that point only knew the Roman Empire, and the emperor was above the law according to their legal code. Because he's setting the legal code. They would say, if he's setting the law, how can he be tried by the law that he set himself? It doesn't make any sense. We don't have a law that we set. We have a law that we interpret as comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We interpret it for our time, our place, as appropriate for our place. Secondly, there is no clerical class. There are ulama, but the ulama are not ma'soom. The ummah is ma'soom. The ijma' is ma'soom. And this is one of those instances where, this is largely theoretical, but I like the comment by Imam al-Dhahabi, who says, al-hujjatu fil ijma'. Where there is unanimity on questions, those are the things which are not questionable by any Muslim. But other areas, everything is open to debate. And thirdly, I want to talk about the word accountability. I'm translating this maybe loosely as amanat. This is not possession. When a ruler is there, they do not possess power, they are entrusted with power. It's an amana in Arabic. A trust can be audited. A trust can be revoked. Trusteeship can be revoked. In the Western doctrine, popular sovereignty means the people's will is bound by nothing. This is largely theoretical, and there's a whole discussion about, sovereignty really belongs to the constituency, the constitution. Or those with constituent power, which basically is usually people in the past, right? This is a struggle that we're dealing with ourselves right now. So in Mawdudi's doctrine, everyone, the ruler, the ruled alike, stands under the law that no one made. Ask yourself which of these two is a better protection against tyranny. Ask yourself, in this country of all countries, which one have we lacked? Am I telling you that Mawdudi answered everything? Obviously not. Maulana Mawdudi, part of my article is to reflect on his critics, his constructive critics. And it is a mark of confidence. This is something which sometimes our movements need, because we can sacralize figures as well. It is a mark of strength and confidence, not weakness, that we can say so, that we can say Maulana Mawdudi was wrong on certain questions. Every one of us is wrong on certain questions. And Imam Malik famously said, كُلٌّ يُؤْخَذُ مِنْ قَوْلِهِ وَيُتْرَكْ. Everyone, you can take from what they say and you can leave from what they say. إِلَّا صَاحِبِ هَذَا الْقَبْرِ. Imam Malik was from Medina. He said, except the person in this qabr, in this qabr. Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is the only person who everything he says we accept. So 2 questions from within our own house deserves to be heard. The first came from the ulama of great stature, Sayyid Abul Hasan Nadwi, among them. Has this reading of politics, has this reading of Maulana Mawdudi made politics the essence of deen? If the whole Quran is read through the lens of the state, and it was an important lens that was being ignored, because the ulama unfortunately had been disempowered and they couldn't find a way to really voice their political positions, and so they had retreated arguably to everything aside from politics. In that context, however, Mawdudi's intervention, then in this book in particular, some of these interventions are possible, are problematic. Is salah simply a training ground? Is dhikr a means of developing a political community rather than an end for itself? Is it rather the case that our politics is there to serve our salah? Our politics is there to serve our dhikr? And our politics should be there to facilitate our greater ibadah, our greater attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not our ibadah and our dhikr there to create people who are able to sort of become politically successful. Which one is the means and which one is the end? Which one is the final goal? That's the question that Maulana Abul Hasan Nadwi asked. And I think this worry is something that needs to be taken very seriously as well. This is a question that is internal to the Islamic movement, in my view. And the second, I will state myself, which is that Hakimiyya answers the question of who commands, but it does not by itself answer what is commanded or who interprets or how texts are weighed against those realities. And that is a slow, patient, humble labor of fiqh, of ijtihad, which has its tools, which essentially requires one to be a scholar. And being a scholar does not mean having a PhD or having Maulana before one's name, but it means having the capacities to read these properly. And also it requires shura, something which unfortunately has been abandoned often by our rulers, but also has been abandoned by the ulama oftentimes. Because the ulama have also, this is also an internal criticism that comes from love. As an alim myself, as someone who's trained in the, Nadwi system, I'm saying that the ulama need to have greater engagement in the public sphere to understand the needs of everyone, not just their own relatively small constituency of ulama and students. And so my judgment is that these critiques are refinements to the concept of hakimiyya. They are in no way refutations of it, because everyone I've mentioned here, including Abu Hassan Nadwi, including the ulama classes, including Mufti Taqi Usmani and his father, Mufti Rafi Usmani, the most important scholars in the history of Deoband, among the most important scholars in the history of Deoband, all recognize the importance of, even if they might not always use the term of hakim. So the sovereign nation state did not abolish the throne of ultimate authority. It took its place. It created a God in the world, in the state itself. And in Bangladesh, we have lived under that sort of divinization of the sovereign. That mortal God has been governing us for half a century in Bangladesh. And the state is answerable to nothing above itself. Such a state that is answerable to nothing but itself has behaved exactly as you would expect a mortal God to behave. It stole elections, it created forced disappearances, and it created Ainaghar. And this is the julum that, when the command answers only to itself, can only result in this sort of julum. Against that, the practical meaning of hakimiyya is startlingly simple, that no ruler is actually sovereign. Every ruler is a servant, bound by the law that ruler did not write, and cannot amend to suit themselves. If you strip away the Arabic, you recognize this for what it really is: the deepest form of a constitutionalism that is grounded in 1400 years of commitment. So I put the question gently back, if you are questioning the value of hakimiyya for us. If, without ever examining it, you dismiss the political vocabulary of your own civilization, while accepting, without question, the political vocabulary of the colonizer, who exactly is being uncritical? Rejecting hakimiyya is not progress, it is regression to barbarism, arguably. It is a regression into colonialism, which we fought so strongly to get rid of in this country, but which we imported by maintaining its institutions, the institutions of the liberal colonial state. Which brings me home to July. In the summer of 2024, the young people of this campus and of university campuses up and down this country did something truly extraordinary. They refused a sovereign who answered to no one but herself. I will not pretend that they were reading Maulana Maududi, of course. This was the innate understanding of a popular mobilization that expressed hakimiyya without knowing that that was what they were doing. No earthly power owns us. This was their moral understanding. This was the premise of hakimiyya that lived within them. Every revolution then faces the same morning after question: In whose name will the new authority then be held? 1971 gave an answer, and we all watched that settlement decay into the very thing that for decades resulted in what we overthrew, inshallah. I want to include myself in that very honorable act, of course, but I was very far, so this is maybe too much of a claim. But the very thing that we all wanted to overthrow in July of 2024, that was actually, in some respects, the result of the 72 Constitution that Ustad Toha so eloquently spoke about. And my submission to you is that in this land, Hakimiyya is not the import. It sits organically with our history, from the earliest Muslims of this delta in 1204 to the ulama and ordinary faithful who never surrendered to this deen. So many of the madrasa students who died in this July 24 revolution, and of course in 2013 who were killed en masse, alongside as your partners within the student movement. With our present, walk past any masjid in this city at Fajr, and with the natural devotion of our people who have never needed convincing that Allah's claim comes first, we recognize that this is not something that needed to be imposed. It came naturally, organically from our communities. What is asked of this generation, however, is not nostalgia, it is construction, to reimagine our organic roots in a modern institutional form, constitutionally serious, economically credible, intellectually rigorous, and spiritually honest. The Quran says, as I mentioned a short while ago, وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَنَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised those who have iman and who act with amal salih, that we will give you that power. But then the end of that verse is يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. This has to be an ongoing process. If you want to succeed, you need to continue to do that ibadah and avoid that shirk that is inherent in creating a sovereign aside from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The condition is that iman and amal salih is necessary, and istikhlaf is the consequence. Istikhlaf is promised to the competent, to competence, to excellence, to ihsan in the engineering, to ihsan in Dhaka University just as much as it requires ihsan in the masjid. And our intention in all of it, the only intention that makes any of it worth doing, is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not to win a campus, as you so successfully did, not to win an election, as we have had pathways towards realizing in a way that we never have in our history, not even to win arguments, it's to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let me end this is my last remarks. Let me end this with where I began. In 1948, a young man stood on this campus and demanded that the state hear the language of its people. And in 2024, a younger generation stood on this campus and refused a state that recognized nothing but its own right to dominate everyone. Between these two moments runs a single thread, and it is the oldest teaching of our deen. With respect to the question of power, hukm belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And whatever authority human beings hold, they hold as an amanat, a trust that is held under him, owed to one another, and one day accounted for in the dunya first, but most certainly in the akhirah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us worthy of that trust, inshallah. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.